Wait, what? I can do that? This is Eric Bell with Wait, what? Financial matters that matter for business and the people that own them. Welcome to this episode of Wait, what? Financial matters that matter for business and the people that own them. This is a special episode to address the coronavirus disease, or COVID-19. It seems nationally this has caught us off guard or our government off guard, but in all fairness, they are moving forward. We're ready for a missile attack, but this quickly spreading disease is covert. We are ready for a missile attack, but this quickly spreading disease is covert and, as we see, deadly, a silent killer. I'm fortunate to have two previous guests with me today to discuss this from a crisis communication and human resource standpoint for business and the owners. LaRon Anderson Bell, again, she's not my cousin, but she is a professor of instruction at Temple University Klein College of Media and Communication. Her specialties are public relations, crisis communication, digital and social media marketing. I also have Doug Bender, who has many decades of experience in the human resource and leadership growth space with several large companies. He also has been a professor at several colleges here in Southern California. LaRon and Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I apologize for doing such abbreviated backgrounds on both of you guys, but I want to kind of get into the topic. And also I want to let our listeners know that we're doing this episode remotely using technology, and we're pulling all three of us together from separate locations. The only people in the studio are me and Brian, the producer.
So you're saying you practice in social distance?
I'm practicing social distance. It's the best I can. And Brian's 6 feet away from me, so we're all good.
Good.
You know, being the gentleman I am, I'm going to start off and let LaRon, start us off. But Doug, please jump in where you can fit in. And LaRon, last time we talked, or on the last show that you were on, you made a distinction between an issue, an emergency, and a crisis.
Right.
What category would you put this one in, and what should small to medium-sized or family-owned businesses be communicating at this time?
Right. Well, we're definitely in crisis mode right now. And just as a reminder, especially for anyone who didn't hear that last episode, a crisis, rather, is going to be a major event that's characterized by an imminent threat to your brand's reputation or to business as usual, and possible or actual harm to individuals. So clearly, we're there right now. And while most businesses should have some sort of plan in place to anticipate things like this and have protocols where they already have thought about how to help their organization or their clients take responsibility for their visibility and proactively communicate, everyone might not be in that boat. So the first thing I would say is that now is not the time to go dark. It's really imperative that businesses, business owners, entrepreneurs, everyone should be really proactive right now about communicating. It's okay to reassure clients. It's okay to leverage the fact that as a business owner, you have a platform. But one thing I would also say, which I had no reason to say the last time we were speaking, is that now is the time to stay in your lane and make room for the experts' messages to be amplified. And that's really hard for people to do. And I'm sure Doug and I can talk more about human resources implications of that, because you want to give accurate information, you want to be timely, you want people to know that, business leadership has their back, so to speak. But what I would say is that applies mostly to people who kind of are their brand. So that might be an entrepreneur, that might be a public personality like a politician, an athlete or an entertainer. You have a responsibility to your communities to really fall back and make room for the experts. Some things that people should be doing right now. If you do not already have a crisis response team or a plan, it's imperative that you create one right now. So you have to work a little bit of double time, but it's not a question of panicking. It's just a question of methodical steps that you follow. So first, who is your team, right? Who are the key roles that you need to have in a decision-making capacity? And so that might be the head of your company, someone from legal, someone from HR, someone from communications or public affairs or whatever you call it. Get that team together, establish who they are and how you're going to communicate. Literally, how you're going to communicate. Does it mean that you will be on Zoom, Skype, Google Hangouts, text messages only, phone conferences? How will that scramble team communicate? Determine the chain of command as well for your organization. hopefully, maybe not very small businesses, but most businesses should already have some sort of chain of command, and that's literally the flow of authority and decisions for your crisis communication. If you haven't already thought about it, who are your stakeholders? Who needs to be communicated with? What are the groups of people who need to hear from you? And so that's, of course, going to include employees who always get overlooked. Employees are sometimes the last group to know. But that's your vendors, that's your business partners, that's stockholders, actual stockholders if you're a publicly traded company. Um, and then other things that would flow from that are, what are your alert protocols? What are the proper channels and vehicles for communication and notification with all of those different stakeholder groups? Have you prepped web and social, whether that means activating pages that you had in the wings, dark pages, so to speak, that have kind of holding statements set up, training your spokespersons, securing your data, make sure that all important company records are stored redundantly and backed up, and just be ready. So that's, kind of a first pass at things that businesses should be doing right now.
So putting the team together is extremely important, is what I'm hearing.
Very important.
Yeah. And then from there, just trickling down who's going to be in charge. It seems like, the owner thinks he's always in charge, but like you said, you need to stay in your lane.
Very much so. And I mean, it may be that you don't have a need to speak to the media about what's going on at your company for your company. And it's about employee or stakeholder facing communication. So that doesn't necessarily have to be the CEO or the president or the executive director. But somebody needs to be in charge of speaking to these different groups and notifying them what the company's doing right now as we deal with this pandemic.
Doug, I spoke to one of my clients today who's has a logistics business, and he said it's business better than normal with all the toilet paper and stuff they are shipping. and, and and basically for him, there's only two people in the office. He kind of sent everyone home. Those that can work from home are working from home, and those that can't work from home, they just basically have a leave of absence. What do you, in terms of that team that Laurent was talking about from an HR standpoint, what do you see some of the critical things that the HR person should be doing or trying to make happen for companies?
Well, that's a great question, and thanks again for inviting us on to kind of have a good conversation about this, Eric. Let me kind of back up before I answer your question to talk about two quick things that I think is really important that Laurent was alluding to. Typically speaking, what we're talking about here is something relatively sophisticated for most organizations, small to medium-sized organizations in particular. So this whole notion about business competency in times of crisis, for example, we know for a fact, I mean, the data is out there that shows that most small and medium-sized organizations don't have crisis management skill sets. And so all of this really, really great information that Laurent is sharing is really stuff that most organizations need to work at proactively. Now we're in crisis mode. So, this is going to be almost like learning a foreign language while you're already there in a new country. You really have to give yourself permission and opportunity to sort of make a few mistakes, but also to make sure that you don't underestimate the real need to do a lot of the things that she's alluding to right now. From an HR standpoint, the same thing is true, right? I mean, most small and medium-sized organizations don't have full-time, on-the-ground HR support and expertise. So I think first things first. I think I shared this in my original podcast with you about HR. You got to go and find yourself somebody who really does have the technical skill set and the understanding of not only just HR, but the impact of crisis situations on organizations. Because a lot of things really matter that you get right, particularly in this set of circumstances, because there could be some legal implications. For example, some of the simple kinds of questions might be things like, an employee reports to work, for example, with a bad cough or has a fever or something like that. What kind of questions can the manager or the supervisor or the owner or HR ask of this person? Now, this may sound like really, really simple, right? Somebody shows up for work, they're coughing and hacking all over the place. You can't just come right out and ask them if they have the coronavirus disease. I mean, it's really,
You really cannot.
now, you think now's not the time to be politically correct. However, there are things that sort of protect that individual and their personal rights as it might relate to any sort of disability or potential disability they might have. And so there are federal laws that might govern even questions like that, even in a crisis situation. So you have to be really, really careful about that. Now, it kind of maybe sends me to my next point, which is, well, can HR, for example, send an employee home who comes to work sick? Uh-huh. And I think the answer to that is yeah. I mean, there's no law that will stop or prevent an organization from being able to protect its resources and other employees as well. And so, under this set of circumstances, the CDC has already basically said that employees who become ill, with symptoms as a result of the pandemic should actually leave the workplace to begin with. And so simply because we're in crisis mode allows organizations to maybe do some things that they might not have done before. And so it just kind of goes on and on and on and on and on. So get yourself expert HR help, but also get yourself expert HR help who really kind of knows and understands how to respond to crisis situations, especially as it relates to the medical situation.
LaRon, when we talk about crisis communication and actionable steps, will one of those steps be to get something out digitally to everybody that would say, hey, if you're coughing or hacking, don't even bother coming in, give me a call? Or what do you think should happen along those lines?
Right. Well, with the advice of your human resources point person or your legal point person at a minimum, in giving, a really good look at what Doug just said about what some of the parameters might be, you should absolutely post communication digitally, but not just digitally.
Yeah.
You have an intranet, of course you should, but there are a lot of things you should be doing right now in terms of communication. Um, so if you have the ability to email an FAQ, if you can post a link to it, even if it's in your intranet, because it's not like I need to go look at what your company is doing as just somebody, out here as a citizen. But if you do post it to your social media platforms, then, a link will go to your intranet and it'll open up and people can see it. Maybe it's a banner or a popover message on your homepage that also goes straight to an intranet. So have some redundancy in terms of where you're posting it, so that employees, vendors, partners, customers, everyone, all of your different target audiences and publics can get to the information and see which portion of it applies to them. Consider a live stream from the head of your company, or the head of HR, a socially distanced live stream. And you can do that safely
Right.
via Zoom or Skype, WebEx. There's lots of tools where you can do that. And in your employee communications, there's a lot of things you need to be particularly clear about. And Doug can probably speak more about that. But, be clear about things like pay, payroll, how that's going to move forward, health benefits, who is and isn't required to be in the office. And to your point, Eric, what are the circumstances under which you should stay home, or call your supervisor to see how to report. If you are doing telecommuting, especially for portions of your employee population who haven't done it before and haven't needed to before, what kind of support are you providing and how do people access that? Services like EAP, right, employee assistance programs, how will those continue? And then where people can find that information if they need to access it again.
LaRon, one of the things you said, when I think about a manufacturing company here in California, a lot of people, there's a lot of multiple languages.
Yeah.
So how does a message get out in multiple languages? If you have the CEO on, he may
Sure.
not speak Spanish or Vietnamese or something of that sort. And also not everybody has a computer.
Right.
So that's one of the challenges too, in terms of those
And
messages
the
out.
thing is, you should already have a way to get that information to people. Now, there are definitely going to be sites where that information was person to person. So that can't happen in certain occupations and for certain workplaces. And so you may have to resort to paper. So if you mail things home, or have a stack available, literally in a bin at the work site that people can come in. If you have somebody who can translate because they would have had to speak to these employees, that person can post the message, here's what to do. I admit though, for a lot of industries that have workers that are seasonal, for instance, or who do not speak English as their first language, there are additional challenges on top of that, but you have to rely on the infrastructure you have in place for how you would have communicated with those employees anyway, even outside of a crisis.
Yeah, I would agree with LaRon, by the way. I think the normal channels, the normal ways of communicating with employees over the course of normal business operations. Those you got those protocols in place and those policies, procedures, practices, systems, and processes. The big difference here, of course, is that you've got to do it. You've got to do it sort of, maybe more real time, more urgently. And so I think the big thing to maybe sort of remember here with this particular question that you raised, Eric, is just making sure that the CEO or the COO really has someone by his side who may be a translator if necessary. Because in normal circumstances, you've had an opportunity to sort of prepare a video or to prepare a written document that's translatable and so forth. But this is kind of real time. And I do believe this is leading to an important point, I hope. I do believe that at the end of the day, now is not the time for the CEO to be bashful. That's my point. I think that individual, whoever that person is, has to be as transparent as possible and as forthcoming as possible about where the organization is, where it feels it needs to be headed, and how the employees in particular as key stakeholders to the success in getting through and beyond this crisis. I mean, what roles that they play is really critically important. I think the first message, though, is really to just make sure that people know and understand that their safety and health and security comes first. Everything else in terms of business operations comes next.
Doug, I know a company who is highly reliant on Vegas, Las Vegas.
Mm.
And, it's killing their business. Knee-jerk reaction is to lay those folks off and some others because of the loss of revenue. And I'm just thinking, can you talk about it from a economic standpoint? I'm just thinking, if you're a manufacturer and you're not making stuff and you're not shipping it, how do you keep everyone afloat?
I literally just before we got on this today, I was counseling for about an hour an international head of an organization about making sure that you make the right kind of calls. This call, by the way, isn't about the welfare and the well-being of people versus the economics. It's a yes and proposition, right? In other words, it's not either or. You can take care of the folks in your organization and do it well, getting through this transition. And you can also exercise your responsibility, your fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the economics of the business is going well. So one of the things that you really do want to do, and one of the things I've been recommending to folks that I've been in touch with for the last couple of weeks is just make sure that, I want to make an important distinction because I think it's really important. That crisis management team that LaRon was talking about earlier isn't the same thing as the operations management team. Those are two separate and completely and distinctly different individuals. Business has to go on, quote unquote, as usual. In other words, you got to keep business as normal as possible for your organization. However, in the meantime, you still have to make sure that you're mitigating against the crisis itself. So what small business people ought to be doing is to checking in with their stakeholder network, their executive team, whatever you want to call it, on a much more regular basis, right? Maybe they're used to meeting, once every a couple of weeks or so. I share a small national business that you know about down in South Houston, and I get on the phone with the CEO every Friday morning for 2 hours. With the coronavirus situation, we're on the phone every day.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so that's
right,
the point I'm trying to make. I think in this particular scenario, in order to protect against the economic impact, I think again you have to first have the mindset that it's really about making sure you're taking care of your people, your stakeholders as well, while you're trying to figure out the impact on the economics of it. But you've got to make sure that it's because it's not business as usual.
Right.
That on the business side, you're meeting more frequently, you're communicating more frequently, you're updating more frequently, you're reacting and responding more quickly, more urgent.
LaRon, you got anything to add to that, or what's your thoughts?
Yeah, actually, sure. I mean, I agree with everything Doug said. And make sure you're speaking to people from an educated perspective. You have to, this is a responsibility of all business leaders, regardless of the size of the business. It's kind of like that idea of putting your own mask on before assisting others.
I love it.
If
That's
you're
right.
dictating the well-being of a bunch of other people, you have a responsibility to share correct, updated information before making decisions that are going to impact anyone or while you make those decisions. So there is some debate, of course, and we're all living through it as to what those credible sources are. I have found that city and state government have been absolutely on point. And I'll go on ahead and say it. The federal government's response has been patchy and somewhat inconsistent. To your point at the beginning of the podcast, Eric, they're getting on board and getting in line. But for right now, local and state government have been really, really, for many states, I'm not going to say everywhere. It really depends on where you are. But I find that that's a really good source of information. And then, communicate frequently, like Doug said. If you used to speak weekly, now maybe it's about daily. If you have if you have a large enough business that, say, you have an intranet, then maybe your routine is a status update at the beginning and the ending of every day. Keep those lines of communication open. So it may be that you have a Q&A or just like an open call, office hours, if you will, every few days through Zoom or something like that, that if not the entire company, because that may be hard to manage, at least your leadership team can reach you and then pass messages on to their direct reports, and have a regular time. It's not sort of like, oh, whenever somebody wants it, have a routine and set it up and get it on the calendar now. Naturally, and it's easy for me to say because I do this for a living, stay calm, keep composed, especially before you write and send any mass communication. I'll give you one tip that I tell clients as well as students: read your emails out loud. That sounds very silly, but you have to, or have someone read it to you. In a pinch, copy and paste it into Google Translate and click the microphone button and let the computer say it back to you if you don't have somebody who can read it to you.
That's great.
It's really important to hear how these things sound. Watch your tone. Try to just be poised and graceful in your communication. It really makes a difference. And experts are around. Experts are everywhere. So if you don't have an HR point person, there are HR consultancies. If you don't have communication support, there are agencies and firms and consultants to help you right now.
LaRon, I think, is making an excellent point, by the way, Eric, because when you're in the moment, when you're in the fray, particularly as the leader of the organization, you are oftentimes encumbered by a lot of filters. I mean, there are a lot of blind spots for you because you're responsible for everything, or at least you think you're responsible for everything.
Right.
So you have got some things that you have to be uber sensitive to as an individual in the way you communicate and how you communicate, which kind of leads me back to another point that she alluded to that I think is really important. A part of putting the mask on yourself first also is really truly about walking the talk. Your employees, your constituencies, your stakeholders are waiting to see what kind of leadership you're exhibiting, because that's their cue as to how they're going to react and respond. And so if you're trying to, sort of force business questions and business issues and business agenda or political agendas, and trying to put those things out there, if you're trying to finesse that and spin that in some way, people are going to pick it up right away and they're going to respond very negatively. And we already know that even in normal times, the level of engagement on the part of employees in organizations is abhorrent. I mean, we 7 out of 10 employees are either not engaged or actively not engaged. And don't get me walking down that particular road. So now you just built in almost certain failure for your organization. Even if you survive the coronavirus, you are still going to have to deal with the aftermath of how you screwed up your communications with your employees by communicating certain things to them, and signaling certain things to them that they're not important, that their situation and circumstances aren't important, that the business is more important. And you definitely don't want to do that. Walk the talk, do the things that you're communicating to people, let them see you doing those things. You can't tell them don't come into the office and then you're coming into the office. It just makes no sense.
Right.
It's just counterintuitive. And it invokes this whole notion that psychologists call cognitive dissonance, right?
Yes.
You're doing something, you're telling me something, one thing, but you're doing something completely different. That's not going to work.
when it's time to come back, let's say the coronavirus is not contained, but we're getting closer and it's kind of taking its course and the numbers are starting to fall down in terms of deaths and people catching it. What's the process? I guess is for both you and Laurent. What should be the process or what should be the crisis management communication going forward at that point before the cure is actually here? Because we can't all sit here for a year and a half waiting for
Right,
a cure.
right. I mean, I think as you begin to get those signals from your government officials that it's okay to release the grip, then you do that in stages. You still don't want to overwhelm your systems. Um, of course, all businesses want to bring people back as soon as they can, especially if they've had to, say, furlough people or things like that. Most people cannot withstand 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks without pay. So if you've got a business where people could not, still get paid, then is there a way financially to, work some one-time payments in, let people know what you've done to make the workplace safe? I'll tell you a quick story. So where the classroom building that I do most of my teaching in, I went back last week. We had a few days, not more than two actually, where we had classes before we went fully online. I did not see any evidence of thorough disinfecting when I got there,
Oh, wow.
but I had my Lysol and my wipes and everything handy. So even if you don't have an industrial janitorial company that happens to come in every night, get, the maids on call. So do something to make sure that you cleaned your workplace, sanitized, done all the things that we're supposed to do to make it safe for people to come back, and communicate that and communicate what the stages will be. You may not be able to bring 100% of everybody back the day after these protocols are lifted for, groupings of 10 versus 50 versus 100. So use the advice that we get from our government officials to dictate how quickly you can come back online. You may have to do some rehiring. I'm working on a project right now where it was essentially a reverse job fair where we were going to have dozens and dozens of people in one room with at tables, sort of displaying what their portfolio is. And employers were going to walk through that room. Of course, it's ridiculously unsafe to do anything like that now, so we're moving it online. But we've also extended the window. We'll be sending reminders out so that people will continue to look at what we're going to transition into a virtual version of that. So you may need to do things like that, go beyond the containment period to remind your investors and your partners and your customers and your vendors what you're doing to ensure that they're safe, what you already did. And you might not be able to predict when things will be back to normal. Any of us, we don't know what the new normal will be. But again, that reassuring, that constant communication and the walking the talk is going to be really important as we go back online or go back to live.
I'm thinking in a manufacturing situation where you have people kind of
Yeah.
shoulder to shoulder getting things done. And those are usually the people who need the paycheck more so than anybody else versus the executives. I mean, how do you bring them back gradually? And then the person raises his hand, says, "Hey, I didn't get brought back. Why did Joe get brought back versus me?" How do you handle that?
So I have a response to that, Eric, because as you well know, a lot of my background was in manufacturing, um,
Mhm.
and manufacturing HR. Laurent alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I think you can't overemphasize the point. I think the way that you kind of ramp up when you're dealing with a crisis management situation is the same way that you ramp down, right? You got to plan out all of that level of detail about how do you, particularly in a manufacturing environment, right? How do you get things back up to speed? For example, if you're in a manufacturing environment and you're operating with, let's just say, four production lines, you're not going to bring everybody back at one time and crank up all four production lines at the same time. A lot of it is going to have to do with what truly just simply makes sense for the business, for the organization. Do we ramp up the one production line, for example, that gives us our best sales margins? Probably. But if it doesn't generate as much volume for us as we need, then maybe we'll come to a different conclusion about that. And then equally important, though, is this whole point about whatever it is that business conclusions you're coming to about what that plan is going to be and how you're going to execute it. again, I think we started out this conversation by saying transparency, transparency, transparency. Make sure that you're communicating to employees. You're probably telling them things now in the wake of a crisis that you wouldn't tell them under normal circumstances
Right.
as an organization. But I think it yields great dividends and benefits for everybody in every stakeholder in the process when you're being fully transparent and you're over communicating to people about this is what we're doing, and Joe the janitor, and here's why. This is why some people may be coming back next week. You may not be coming back until next month. Let me make another quick point about that because I think it's really important. There was a recent study that was done literally within the last year or so that shows that, and I heard it quoted about a few days ago on the evening news. Most people in this country, the richest country in the world, can't even afford a $400 unforeseen emergency.
Right. Right.
They can't afford it, right? So now here's a coronavirus that's actually putting people out. And we all know, by the way, right now, this very second, folks who actually have been laid off or who have been furloughed from work and that sort of thing. I've got a son in Southern California who's a teacher who was told late last week that he's going to be going on vacation for 3 weeks unpaid, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
so,
Wow.
so fortunately for him, I think he's in a pretty good spot. I think he can afford that $400 emergency crisis. But the vast majority of people, literally the vast majority of workers in this country, cannot afford a $400 deal. So I do think it's important for organizations as a part of their thought process, their deliberations, to try to figure out ways to not maybe just about getting people back to work faster, but also trying to find ways to help people sort of mitigate the painful impact of the lack of an economic safety net. So that might mean, for example, offering employees a $100 bonus just because, or a $200 bonus just because. One of the other things I want to get in before I forget about it is that when this is all said and done, when the smoke is clear, when people are in fact back at work and they're on the production lines trying to do what it is they need to do, one of the things that it really behooves the crisis management team to do, as well as the operations management team, is really do a little bit of a postmortem. What worked, what didn't work. Well, what would I wish we could have actually just done better or done differently in some particular way. It's not a criticism to try to figure out who may have screwed some things up, but how can we be better at this as we move into the future?
Agreed. I agree. You always have to evaluate your performance. So whether that's a public relations campaign, a marketing campaign, a rollout of a product, or your response in an emergency or a crisis or things that are unexpected. To your point, Doug, what worked, what didn't. If something of this magnitude should happen again, what lessons did we learn? All of that is important, as part of your postmortem, if you will. You have to think about it. You have to document it. The people who worked through it the first time may not be with you the next time. That's why you have to document it, and learn from it. Tweak your policies and procedures accordingly. It may not, hopefully, it won't come to this again, but you may have a pocket of employees passing around the flu because they work in close quarters, or strep, or something like that. And you can learn from how you responded to this COVID-19 issue if you document and, of course, evaluate how you did, evaluate your own performance right away.
Brian just put in front of me that the Orange County has banned all public and private gatherings under emergency health
Mhm.
order. It seems like that's a course that everyone's taken. I heard the mayor of LA discussing about giving people a break on their rent if they're not making money.
Right.
That water won't be cut off. Just from a personal standpoint, electricity won't be cut off. They're just going to go ahead and foot the bill.
Yeah.
The cities are. I'm hoping that everybody does that. Are you guys experiencing that in your areas, or what's going on with you?
Yeah, that's happening all over the country. As I said before, I'm on an active member of a crisis management team right now for an international organization, and of course, with the small business that I chair in Texas, we have a national network of about 1,600 folks. Everybody, I think, is being, well, almost everyone is being absolutely wise and prudent and measured in their steps about how they act and react to these kinds of things. Getting back to an earlier point that Laron made, I really applaud municipalities and state governments and that sort of thing, they really are treating this thing very seriously, but they're doing it in a way that's different than what we've ever seen before. What they're doing is that they're taking time to make sure that they're mindful of the position that these sudden changes in economic direction poses for each and every individual. So, yes, here locally and around the country, that was the point I was trying to make. Of what I'm seeing, and even outside of this country, of course, what I'm seeing is that politicians, employers, everyone is making sure that they are being sensitized to the needs of people that they just thrusted them into. And I think it's a good thing for humanity in general as we go through this whole crisis and get to the other side of it. I think it'll give us some new ways of looking at stakeholder relationships, and not just employees, but how we work with and deal with suppliers and vendors and so forth and so on. Because a lot of those are also small organizations, mom and pop type organizations that, frankly, if you're a larger employer, you may be providing them with 70% of their revenue, their small business revenue. And so, when you flip the switch on your employees, you flip the switch on them and their livelihoods as well. So yeah, there's a huge sensitivity to this, and I don't think it's going to permanently go away. I think we get on the other side of this crisis. I think there will be lots of lessons learned, particularly as it relates to this whole kind of conversation about civility and compassion and treating each other how we would want to be treated in a similar situation. I think that's going to play out in the future in policies and protocols and procedures and practices of organizations. It's just good business sense.
It seems like a lot of employers are learning that I don't need everybody to show up to get stuff done. This crisis is, we're talking about doing things using technology to better serve our companies, and they're starting to find out that I don't need everybody to show up. So hopefully this will be a trend that's going to continue on in terms of people working from home and reducing traffic and so forth and so on.
That's one of the interesting side effects, by the way, of any sort of a crisis moment, if you will, particularly as it relates to business and industry. It's kind of like, well, we were able to get past that somehow. I canceled my attendance to a very large conference that's being held in the Bahamas, and the big question that was being asked among the senior team was, so do we have to have this trip? And if so, what is it that we really actually have to get done? And what it came down to was that, we probably spend on a somewhat routine basis, maybe about, 2 half days in business sessions, right? But we can distill that activity, leveraging technology in a crisis situation. We can distill that activity down to about maybe 2 hours. So now we thought, well, wait a minute, why? So at the end of the day, why weren't we doing that to begin with anyway?
Right. It brings to mind that we all kind of tongue in cheek say, "Oh, well, this conference, this meeting could have been an email," right? And so pivoting to that all the way around, and yeah, I agree. I applaud the municipal governments and all of that who are being really sensitive to how people are being impacted and thinking of ways that they can mitigate what's happening. Where I am, there are, thinking about children who are displaced from school who relied on free lunch, free meal programs.
Yes.
So we've got places that are open up, not necessarily asking restaurants to totally shut down, but they can only do takeout or pickup, right? They can't necessarily deliver. So local filters through which businesses can look at that, I think, are really helpful. And we will see, I hope, that things that businesses and that government thought might not be possible actually are possible if push comes to shove.
So the thing that I'm always grateful for in times like these are the lessons that we learn, and I'm always awed at the resiliency of the human spirit. I'm always in awe and grateful for the level of innovation and creativity that comes out of these things that leads us to, other successes and different kinds of successes as we continue the march forward over the arc of time. And so, while this is a really a hugely serious thing for the world, this coronavirus situation, I also really appreciate some of the real positive things that are going to come out of this in terms of the way that we leverage technology, the way that we work and play together as human beings. And I just think that that we'll be on the back end of this thing. Will come out to be more powerful, smarter, and in better shape.
Laurent, did you have something you want to say?
I did. I thought of something as we transition to going back to work and all of that. There will be a temptation, especially if all the efforts we're making to flatten the curve, as they say, and to be socially distant and reduce the spread of the virus, there will be a temptation for people in your communities, in your organizations to say, oh, well, we overreacted. Look, everyone didn't die. And, we hear that a lot on the crisis communication side of things. So I would say another thing for businesses to think about is to find supportive, not antagonistic, but supportive ways to say, even now, the thing about public health protocols when you're trying to slow the spread of something or the transmission of something is that if it works, besides the fact that that's a good thing, it should feel like,
Right.
it was all for nothing.
Yep.
And so putting that message out there now, and I've even done that with my children who are, for the most part, adults, because, we're in a society that is very much about individual freedom. We are having more trouble in the United States getting people to stop doing things that would spread this disease than some of our, the sister nations and continents, because Americans are like, well, I should be able to do whatever I want. And if you tell me I can't, then I'm going to want to do it even more. So, of course, I'm still going to church. Of course, I'm still going to restaurants, and even justifying it by saying, well, God's got us, or how will these workers at the restaurants eat if we don't go? So there's, again, it's not a checkbox exercise. It's not something where it's like, forget, call it all off. There are ways to do all of that. There are ways to still be true to your faith. There are ways to still support these businesses and still be safe. And so, again, going back to my point, communicating now that the nature of public health catastrophes is that the response has to be really big to keep us all safe. And if and when we emerge safely, it will prove that the system worked, not that we overreacted.
This is a really, really critically important point, and I applaud Ron for bringing it up, because it kind of reminded me of something that I used to say an awful lot in reaction to life insurance. And most folks don't like to talk about life insurance, right? But one of the things that we come to understand about things like that over the course of history, it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it, right?
Can't even get it when you need it. All right.
And the same thing is really kind of true for something like this. I mean, we've all also been involved in work-related settings and situations where we were able to really do something and do it so incredibly well, or we've seen other people do things and they do it so incredibly well. We think, wow, that's really kind of easy. Not really. And so, to get on the back end of something like coronavirus situation, and to be able to say, well, gee, I don't understand what all the commotion was about. You're right. You don't understand what all the commotion was about, and be thankful, frankly, that overreaction, if you will, that LaRon was talking about earlier, yielded a result that led you to that point in your thought process, because that meant that we did exactly what we were supposed to do, and maybe even better.
Right.
Because otherwise, who knows what the data is? The prognosticators and the medical experts out there. There are some folks, for example, who will say that, well, but look at the flu. The flu kills so many thousands of people a year. Yes, that's true, but this is definitely not the flu.
Right.
And I think to be informed, as LaRon mentioned at the top of the hour when we started talking, to be informed and to be informed the right way, I think also helps to make all the difference in the world. Some people are just not going to respond to rational thinking, and some of them are you're just going to have to educate with facts and figures.
Doug, and you made up a good point. There's a thing out there called business continuation insurance.
Yes.
And I would think some of the larger companies or medium-sized companies may have that in place, but there's probably a lot of companies thought it wouldn't be you wouldn't need it. And if you don't have it, you can't get it now.
There you go.
It's not going to be available to you. That's for
not in a
sure.
pinch,
Yeah.
not in a crisis.
That's true. And again, I can't overemphasize, how much, during my corporate career, every organization that I worked with, Uncle Ben's Foods, M&M Mars, I mean, you just go right down the list, a Miller Brewing Company, they all had very robust, proactive crisis management programs and systems in place.
Mm-hmm.
And we practiced that stuff so that when that time ever happened, and for me, in the course of my corporate career, it happened one time. It was 9/11. 9/11. But I got to tell you, looking back on it, all of that practice that we didn't think was necessary really came to bear at that moment in history.
I bet it came in handy.
And it worked incredibly well for us because, factories were shutting down and out of an abundance of caution and all kinds of things were going on. We were taking people out of the air. I mean, there were just so much that was happening, but we were, to Laurent's point earlier, we were staying calm and we were following the yellow brick road. We had a guide, we had a manual. We knew exactly what step 1, step 2, step 500 was going to be.
Right.
And it makes a difference.
Right. Well, I appreciate you both being with us today. Any final thoughts from either one of you before we sign off?
Thank you for having us on.
Thank you so much for having us.
I may have you back once we get over this hump so we can talk about what to do next. So
sure.
Stay tuned. If you want to get hold of LaRon or Doug, please call me at area code 714-643-2500, 2500, I should say. And my extension is 420. Thanks for being with us on this episode. Thank you.